Hi, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that ACMI and RMIT University respectfully acknowledge Indigenous ancestors and elders, past and present, and that we acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. I know we're conducting this session online, scattered across Victoria and other states, maybe other countries. I personally speaking to you from Melbourne's inner north on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations. And I think it's important to recognize that we're conducting this business on their unceded territory. Indigenous sovereignty has never been extinguished. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Douglas Wilson. I'm a lecturer at RMIT University's Bachelor of Design Games program, and I'm also a co-owner of a Danish games studio, Die Gute Fabrik. Just to recap, if you're joining us for the first time at this series, RMIT Games is co-hosting this talk series with our friends at ACMI. The series runs for a few more weeks, every Monday at 6 p.m. Melbourne time. And the sessions are also being recorded for later viewing. So big thanks to the ACMI staff who's here in the background for running the infrastructure to get all this up online. We will be taking some questions later on in the session from the live YouTube chat if you're joining us live. So feel free to write your questions there. We will get to it kind of later in the session after we interview our guest for a little bit. So today, we're very pleased to welcome Jason Imms, joining us all the way from Hobart, Tasmania. Hi, Jason.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Yes, super great to have you here. To give everyone an overview of who Jason is, if you've never met him before, I'm going to read his bio, which gives a kind of good comprehensive overview. Jason has worked in software quality assurance for the better part of 20 years and is currently the global head of QA for LiveTiles, an enterprise software company that extremely doesn't make games. By the way, quick side note, we'll be abbreviating quality assurance as QA throughout this talk, in case you've never heard that abbreviation before. Okay, so Jason ran the Machine QA, providing QA services and consulting to indie game studios in Australia and the US, working on titles including Armello, Mark of the Ninja, The Framed Collection, just to name a few. He also worked as a freelance journalist for some of the world's most recognizable games mastheads. We'll talk about that as well in this interview. Jason is a father of 5, staunchly Tasmanian, sits on the Freeplay board, and is one of the founders of Tasmanian Game Makers. Hi, Jason. Was that all? I guess is a good overview to you. Again, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm really interested in your career and how it's hit these kind of different points in different industries, and we're gonna jump into that in just a little bit. But before all of that, I want to zoom out and discuss QA. Quality assurance a little bit more generally. To do that, Jason, can you give us a brief summary of what QA is and what a QA specialist typically does day to day?
Sure. I think a lot of people assume that QA analysts or specialists or engineers or whatever kind of appendage you put on your title, I think that they tend to assume, especially in games, that they're just going to play games all the time. And you know, there's definitely something of that. You will definitely spend a lot of time with a controller or a mouse and keyboard in hand. But it isn't as kind of utopian and exciting as all that. You're not going to just kind of play games and have fun the whole time. In the games field, especially on larger titles, you'll probably spend most of your time like hammering away at one piece of functionality, one mechanic, one level, one area, and you'll just keep going through it, trying to find issues with it. But I think to me, quality assurance is far more than just the testing part, the part where you're actually trying to do the breaking. QA, the reason I choose QA, quality assurance, as opposed to just testing is because it's a larger discipline. It's very interrelated with risk management. So risk management is a big part of what we do. And we're constantly talking to stakeholders and studio heads and things about how you're going to manage risk. When you press that big green release button, how confident should you be? And that's the conversation we want to be constantly having with the people that we work with. And we do that through some fairly complex reporting, the documentation and amelioration of risk, elucidation of risk. We will absolutely advocate for players. I think that's a really important role because Our job is to sit in the player's seat and give feedback early, give feedback to the team early, before it ever actually hits players' hands, and say it would actually be better if. And when you're a bit more experienced, you can start to say those things with some authority, and people listen to you. It's quite exciting. I have an anecdote about that I can sprinkle in later if you like.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that answer, though, can you tell us a little bit about, right? So there's like QA reporting bugs. Level 2, if you do this, you can't complete it. Or, hey, the game crashes if you do this. But just there, you were also getting at a kind of maybe more higher level design centric feedback, like talking about advocating for the player. So maybe it's not that the game crashes, but that putting your head in the player perspective, you might recommend doing this in the game. Can you talk about the difference between that kind of more like bug centric role of QA and that, like, how you and when you bleed into like giving more design feedback?
Sure. You will get hired to do the former. You will get hired to find bugs. That is what a QA person is hired to do. But once you become more and more familiar with the project, and more importantly with the team, and you start to gain some respect, and your opinion is heard and understood, and critically, you've got a good relationship with those people, so that when they hear you say it would be better if we did things differently, they don't hear you saying what you've done is bad or what you've done is faulty. What they hear you saying is it's really close, but gee, it would be great if it did X, Y, and Z. It's actually an opportunity as opposed to someone poking holes in their hard work.
Yeah.
And that is really fulfilling to me. I'm not a game designer, and I would never claim to be one. I think I'd be a bad one, but I think I'm pretty good at I've been doing this for long enough that I'm pretty good at being able to say, I think it would feel better if the player had the choice of, say, on the Switch, if I can do what you're asking me to do with the touch screen, or I can do what you're asking me to do with the controller, rather than making me go into an options menu and change that setting over, just let me do it. And let's come up with a framework for allowing them to do that at will, perhaps even interchangeably, and they'll have a much smoother, much nicer experience. And yeah, I gave a very similar feedback on one of the projects that I worked on a few years ago. And it went back and forth with the team for a while because it was definitely extra effort for the team to do that, more work. Ended up going ahead with it and putting it in. And that actually got called out by a games journalist on one of my favorite podcasts as being a really nice touch. And I don't think I've ever felt more proud of anything I've ever done in my own work than having that thing caught up. So yeah, you can definitely affect design.
We'll talk as we kind of jump into your career. I think we'll get back a little bit to that theme of like building relationships with the teams that you're working with. But before we get there, let's keep talking about QA. So you haven't just worked in the games industry. You've led QA teams for both enterprise software companies, as you kind of joked, like super far away from video games in some ways, but then also done literal video games quality assurance. What are some of the challenges of doing effective QA for video games specifically, like in contrast to the software industry? How does that change a little bit when we move from enterprise software to video games? Sure.
Functionally, it's the same, but the realities of those two fields are quite different. So, functionally, I'm tasked with looking at this product, whether it's a game or a piece of enterprise software, giving it some predictable inputs and assessing whether or not those inputs produce expected outputs. I don't know how the system works inside. It's what we call black box testing. The system itself is a completely unknowable black box, but it can receive inputs and give outputs. So the process there is exactly the same. We write test cases, we execute test cases. But the ways that it differs primarily are frankly, budgets and to some extent, I think respect for the field are different between the two. And I don't mean that to kind of have a go at games. I don't mean that to have a go at smaller studios that might not have money to throw at doing QA in a really expensive way. I just mean that the enterprise software has been around for longer. It's a more established industry, and therefore there is more money to go around, and there is more money to spend on doing these things right. And often they have kind of a higher risk profile, because if in enterprise software we release a critical bug that negatively affects customers, those customers could be really massive companies that pay us lots of money every single year on a recurring contract that could then become under threat. Whereas as opposed to games where some players might be inconvenienced, or we might get some negative reviews on the store, which are not nothing by a long shot. But they can have, they're just a kind of different set of stakes.
Do you feel like those black boxes tend to be like thinking about the enterprise systems that you test versus games? Do the complexities feel kind of similar as like as a QA person testing those, as you called them, black boxes?
They can do. You could make, I could sit here and make a case for the idea that really big enterprise systems are very complex and therefore have more inputs and therefore have more combinations of outputs. And that's probably true. But when you break them down to like a functional level, each individual functional area of a product will have a similar number of inputs and outputs, and there just might be more functional areas in an enterprise product compared to a game. But then you'll have games that are massively complicated and have heaps, and they may be very, very, very complicated compared to an enterprise product that's more simple. So, yeah, I think they can be quite similar.
We'll talk a little bit more later about some advice that you have for games QA and so forth. But let's finally kind of dig into your career history. How did you get involved in QA? It wasn't first in games, was it?
No, I was studying computing at the University of Tasmania, and had previously been working at Domino's Pizza, which is not a quality assurance job. Although, I guess you want the pizzas to meet a certain level of quality, but that wasn't my job there. I made dough. And while I was studying computing, there was some people there advertising for some kind of junior roles at a local software company. And they were offering what to me at the time was a massive fortune compared to the $6.36 I think I was earning at Domino's back then per hour. Oh my goodness. And it made sense. I was studying in the field. I may as well have a go. And I went and applied alongside a lot of other students and was lucky enough to be selected. And so I took a junior position testing some council, like Hobart City Council software, I think back then, for taking fines money from people.
Wow.
And I did that for about 6 months, and did well enough at it. And then that contract finished up, and I ended up bouncing around a couple of other firms around Hobart that do similar work, often government contracts doing bespoke software in a fixed price capacity. So none of this fancy agile software development stuff back then. It was all awful waterfall methodologies. But yeah, it was making pretty dry government contracts, because there's a lot of that kind of work around Hobart. A lot of software companies that offer that service.
What was it about QA that you think kept you coming back? I mean, clearly, like the money and the job opportunities were there, but like, did you start digging into the kind of mindset of QA? Like, what stood out to you that made you either feel like I'm good at this, or I like doing this, or I see a future in this?
I felt like I was good at it. Once I got into it, I definitely identified it as a skill set. It was something that I was good at. But my time at Domino's was not completely disconnected from this, because when you're there and doing that kind of work, it's very manual labor and it's very repetitive. And so you kind of get into a zone and you click off your brain, you get into the mode and you get the job done. And to some extent with really low rung testing where you're running other people's test cases, you kind of do the same thing. And when you get into that mode, you become attuned to unexpected changes. So I know that when I run these test cases for the 100th time, it's going to go like this. It's going to take this many clicks and it's going to be this fast. And if anything differs, it'll stand out to me. I think humans are really, really good at kind of observing exceptions to things. They're really good at noticing when their music shuffle has repeated the same artist too close together or something. We're really good at identifying that stuff. And I kind of felt that I was pretty good at that task. And I kept going. I definitely didn't go into it going, I want to work in QA, right? Because no one trains you. There's no training at all, at least back then, in tertiary education for doing testing and doing quality assurance. So I didn't go into it seeking that role, but I definitely landed in it and found my happy place.
So there you were talking about some of like the entry roles, like using other people's test cases. But from what I understand, you kind of like moved up in the QA world and started managing QA teams and helping write the test cases. Can you talk about that kind of progression and like how the work then changed for you?
Sure. I found myself working for a company that back then was called Ditech Solutions, and we were working on some really, really big projects, like many millions of dollars at a time. And you can't muck around with those. You can't do things cheaply. You can't do things quickly. You need to really commit. And I really enjoyed that. And that company was accelerating very fast and taking on multiple projects at a time. So because I'd been there for a little while as just a standard tester, but not a junior anymore, but definitely not a leader. And I'd been working quite closely with my test manager, my boss, who'd kind of been mentoring me a bit and giving me some training because he saw someone who wanted to stick with it. And I think that's really critical. I think people who are coming into the field, if they can show some commitment to the field, they're likely to accelerate fast because a lot of people take QA jobs as a stepping stone, it's a very transient workforce. They often will take a low-rung QA job just to get in the door and then want to step sideways into other roles. But if you can show some interest and some grit and want to stick with it, it'll be an opportunity for you to move up quite quickly. And that's what happened to me. So he took an interest in me and gave me some training. And then I found myself with a team to lead on a really massive project, which was scary, but we got it done. There were a few weekends working there.
So that's this kind of enterprise software world, which you're in now, but kind of at some point you transitioned to games journalism, which we'll talk about. You're in this world of like enterprise software. How do you get into games from there?
Yeah, it was weird. I've told this story a few times, and I often use the word luck to describe it. And some people have responded to that negatively because they don't believe in luck, and that's fine. But it is strange. So I was working at a software company, a whole separate one. I think I've worked at 7 or so now around Hobart over the years. And at that point, I was managing the QA department for that company. Not many people, it was only 4 of us. But I was running that team, and I'd been there for a good while. And all of my interests were still there. I still loved playing video games in my spare time. And I was a massive fan of Whiskey Media back then, which was a media company that had a few different mastheads underneath it. They had Giant Bomb back then. They had tested.com. They had a Comic Vine and a movie one that I forget the name of off the top of my head. And I was a massive fan of Giant Bomb and of Tested, really enjoyed the work that they did. And listening to the podcasts and reading the articles and being in forums and things, I got some access to the interiority of those editors. And I kind of got the impression that they were struggling to keep up with their workloads. And so I had this kind of interest in English that I got from a very wonderful teacher in my year 12 who took me from hating English to actually having a real passion for it. And I was keen to do something with that, but I had no training. And anyway, I just sent them an email. I straight up just sent them an email and said, looks like things are tough and you could use some help. I would love to be considered if you're interested in an intern or a freelancer or something like that. I'd really love to contribute to the work that you're doing. And I was lucky enough that they said yes. They happened to be looking, and that was one person they didn't have to go out and seek. They just had someone lined up to go. And so they taught me everything. Norman Chan and Will Smith of tested.com really gave me my access to the technology world. Tested's a technology website. But they taught me how to write. They taught me how to publish quickly. They taught me how to kind of respect the audience. They taught me about style and all the rest of it. And after Giant Bomb shut down and where all the masters were broken up and sold to different companies, I lost that freelance role. But I went to a few other tech sites until I found myself working for Tim Colwell over at games.on.net, which is sadly gone now. And then I just pestered him. I just pestered Tim as much as I could to go from writing his Friday tech column to being able to write about some games. So I think the first games article I wrote was a review of Assassin's Creed 3, I think. So my first games article was a review of quite a large franchise title. And we just went on from there, kept gaining opportunities to write more and more about games and less about tech.
So from what I understand, having talked to you earlier, that transition was gradual. It's not like one day you woke up and were like, all right, I'm gonna quit my job in QA and just give it a go. Like it seems like you kind of scaled your days kind of slowly up and up and up in games journalism. Can you talk about doing that transition kind of gradually?
Sure. Thank you for that clarity. Yes, I started out just doing the writing on the side, absolutely in my evenings and on weekends and stuff, whenever I could get the time. It quickly became an opportunity to write quite frequently for Tested, to the point where they could support me doing that work. I could earn enough doing that work 1 day a week to cut my day job back by 1 day a week. And I was lucky enough to be supported by the owner of the business I was working for at the time to do that. He was a wonderful boss, actually, who said, I don't expect anyone to work for me forever. And if you've got a dream, I want you to chase it. As long as you don't leave the state. You got to stay here, keep your income coming into Tasmania. So he gave me the freedom to do that. So I did that 1 day a week and worked for him 4 days a week. And then my writing kind of picked up even further. And so I made it 3 days a week at my day job, 2 days a week writing. And then it picked up even further and more and more. And I kept chasing different publications until I got to the point where I could justify resigning and working as a journalist full time. But at that point, I had probably 8 active publications. It was a lot of work to be able to contribute to all of those different publications with all of those different voices, different publishing interests, extremely different audiences, despite the fact they're all gamers. Some really wonderful audiences who were really interested in the people behind the work, some that couldn't care less about the people behind the work, some that were completely toxic and awful, and I would never like to work for them again. But yeah, the way I went full time was by diversifying my publication load. And the main way I did that was by attending events, meeting editors. I went to the US, went to GDC, covered GDC. Freelance journalists out there, if you want to find opportunities, don't seek to go to E3, seek to go to GDC, because that's where the developers are, and they're the ones with the stories.
Well,
if
we
ever have
travel,
one again,
that's right. Well, maybe on that note, so how long were you kind of full time in games journalism? And just to clarify, so that for your whole time being full time in games journalism, you never got to the point where you were just full time on one publication. Like you were kind of juggling all these publications throughout. Is that right?
That is true. Aside from a 3-month full time stint working for GameSpot.
Got it.
I sat on the news desk for GameSpot covering Eddie as he moved from the US to Australia. That was right toward the end of my tenure as a games journalist. But otherwise, yes, it was absolutely juggling different publications and constantly pitching for new work. And yeah, I did spend some time. I was a regular contributor to Hyper Magazine as a columnist. But that wasn't a contract work. It was still freelance. It was just a reliable set of articles. And I was also the sole Australian correspondent to Killscreen magazine. So that was some regular work as well. But again, still freelance. The only actual written, signed, time-bound contract I had was with GameSpot. Yep.
And how many years between leaving QA entirely, being full time, before you started to get back into QA?
It was about 2.5 years I spent working full time as a games journalist. And then I did my work with GameSpot, which was awesome. I really loved working with that team. They're wonderful people. And it was really amazing getting to contribute to like a 24-hour news cycle with news teams around the world coming online and offline as they wake up. Really professional team. But what was actually hard about that was I finished my 3 months with GameSpot. I worked really hard thinking if I do a really awesome job, they won't want to let me go. They won't, I'll be so awesome, they won't be able to afford to let me go. And they ended up having to let me go. And they were very sweet about it, very regretful. But it was a fill-in role. I would be taking Eddie's job if I stayed around. There wasn't room to have another person permanently on the team. And so, and right at the end of that, I also had a child. So I took some time off to be a dad. And so I was coming off the back of 3 months of work that was all committed. So therefore 3 months of not pitching for new work.
Yeah.
And then taking time off for multiple weeks, probably about a month in total. So it was actually 4 months of not doing any pitching whatsoever. So then I'm back and I need to start my pitching again, start pitching, land some articles, write them, publish them. And now I'm waiting to get paid. And so basically I've gone almost 5 months without a single bit of income. And That was very, very hard a very hard hole for me to kind of mentally dig myself out of. And it was at that point that the machine opportunity came my way.
Yeah. So tell us about the machine, this moment at which you kind of end up transitioning back to this former life of QA, but now QA for games, not enterprise software.
Sure. So my business partners at the machine approached me, and I'd gotten to know them over the years as a journalist. One of the best things about being a games journalist is you build a really incredible network of people that you can get in touch with pretty quickly. And they said, we run a game studio, we need testing, and we're also aware that there's no one offering this as a service in this region to game studios. So it's a completely open competition field. So what we would like to propose is that we build a company that offers this as a service. We would be your first customer, but you would also be able to sell the service onwards. And they would basically prop this business up underneath me. And it would be an opportunity for me to use my network in the games industry and marry it to my, at the time, 15 years of experience in quality assurance and kind of bring both of those lives together.
Yep.
And I said no, because the idea of running my own company was extraordinarily horrifying to me. But then kind of my brain came knocking and said, this is way too good an opportunity to pass up. You should absolutely give it a go. What's the worst that could happen? What's the worst that could happen? You might fail and you'll just go back to freelancing, and that's fine. Turns out there's quite a bit more that could happen. Burnout is a really serious thing.
We won't make you go into the full gory details, but
Sure.
I know you did eventually make the kind of difficult decision to shut down the company, which you've talked about publicly before. Can you summarize what were some of the challenges of running that company, and what are some key lessons you learned about not just QA but the games industry in running the machine?
I think the hardest lesson, aside from some just business stuff, there was lots of business stuff I had to learn. I think the hardest lesson was, despite the fact that there was no competition in this region, and by that I mean Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific, there were a lot of potential companies out there that could contract the machine. They just weren't ready. They weren't ready. Everyone was aware that they needed QA. Everyone knew that they could be doing better. Oh yeah, we could really stand to be doing more quality assurance. But that isn't enough. It isn't enough to be aware that you need the task. It's a lot harder to then commit to spending a bunch of money to do it well. And my goal with the machine was to really provide a pretty boutique service. I wanted to do quality well. I wanted to do a high quality effort at quality, and I didn't want to kind of half-ass it, to be frank. Yeah. I wanted those teams to get a picture of what it would really mean to have someone working for them and really committed to doing quality well. So the machine would embed itself. The idea of the name of the machine was it would attach itself to another studio and make it better. So I would actually embed myself or one of my staff into a studio remotely, and they would work with that studio every single day. They would attend their stand-ups. They would be a member of that team until the end of the contract, at which point they would retract themselves. And there just weren't that many studios out there who were ready to do that. There weren't that many studios out there who were willing to spend that money. And they were also, and I, through no fault of their own, I think they were just unaware of what that would mean, what it would actually take to do QA well. Not just money, but also methodology-wise. In order for a QA team to be really effective, we need to be getting really good inputs from the development team. Yep. And we need to be aware of what's coming, and we need to be aware of when it will arrive and what state it'll be in and how it should perform and how it should behave. And if none of that is documented and everyone's just kind of throwing features at the product until it's a full product, then it's really hard for us to be effective. We become very expensive exploratory testers. Yeah. And not everyone can just do exploratory testing. It's a whole arm of QA. I still do a lot of it. Enterprise companies still do a lot of it. But for us to be able to commit to doing QA well, we then found ourselves having to do lots of just agile methodology training for smaller studios that weren't aware of how to do that stuff already. So we'd have to not only educate the stakeholders on what it's going to take to do QA well. We'd also have to train the teams on how to create endpoints for QA to attach to, and then we could start billing for the QA work. And that was just a lot of unpaid pre-sales work that I wasn't prepared for.
Well, so kind of flipping that perspective, at the Games Connect Asia Pacific GCAP 2018 conference, you gave a great talk about best practice quality assurance for small teams. So instead of embedding this external person to the process, how small teams themselves, like what general lessons could they learn from QA to implement within their own teams? Now, this talk is available on YouTube, and I'll link it in the chat for anyone who wants to watch live. Great talk. Definitely recommend it. I'm not going to make you summarize the entire talk, but what is one lesson, if you only had to pick one piece of QA advice that you would give to small teams? Like, what's one standout thing a lot of small teams do wrong in terms of QA, do you think?
Sure. I think I really like the idea of quality being a cultural issue. So quality is something that everyone at the studio is responsible for. If you've got, let's say you're a studio privileged enough to have a dedicated quality assurance person, it isn't their job to be responsible for quality. Everyone is responsible for the quality of the product. And that's kind of a hard thing for some teams to get their heads around. Often quality assurance and testing are left until pretty late in the process. In some studios, they're completely left to external actors. So you might, for the large bulk of the testing work might actually be done by the player base in the context of an early access title or something like that, which, let's not get into the politics of unpaid labor from your paying customers, but that's not an insignificant thing. So for me, the big takeaway from that talk is everyone needs to contribute to quality, and if you aren't in a position to employ someone to do it for you or do it alongside you, you absolutely need to conscientiously make the time for it. You can't spend the money on it. Well, the other thing you can spend is time. So make sure your team is reliably and regularly doing testing effort, not just on your own work, but on each other's work. You could even dedicate a certain time of the week to all sitting down for an hour and a half as a group and having fun just playing your game together, or playing it up on the big screen and seeing what people see and what people hear and what people shout out, and make it fun. Like, if you can afford to get some pizzas and put some drinks on and make it just a part of your Friday afternoon routine. And then you can do the labor of coming up with a way to document the things that you find. Now we've got all this bug information. Where should we put it? Maybe we need some kind of task tracking tool. You should absolutely get a task tracking tool. That's my other big takeaway. If you don't, doesn't matter how small your team is, there's no excuse for it. You can get a bunch of them for free if your team is small enough. So I don't care how many people you have on your team, you need a task tracking tool, and you're really playing with fire. And if you think you don't.
Yep. Great. Well, I mean, I have many other questions about QA that I'm wanting to ask you. In the interest of time, I want to ask you a few questions on a different topic, and then we'll try to. We are getting some questions from the chat, so I'll make time for some of those as well. So, in addition to all your work in QA, games QA, enterprise software QA, and games journalism, you have also been really involved in building a game making community. So for you in Tasmania, where you live, partly through the Taz Game Makers organization, which we can also link in the live chat. First, can you tell us a little bit about Taz Game Makers and what it does? While you do this, by the way, we'll put up a nice little photo of you and some of the community members together.
Sure. So the Taz Game Makers community came about, around 2015, I think, 2010. So I don't know, a lot of years ago. I went to a Freeplay, and at the time I'd been a games journalist for a while, but I'd primarily been focusing on US publications, and because the US is a very insular culture, I was therefore focusing very much on US studios and US games, and I found myself with an opportunity to attend Freeplay and cover it for Hyper Magazine. I'd never really heard of Freeplay before. I knew it had been around for a while, but it had always kind of been in my periphery as someone who was focusing primarily on AAA titles. And so I got to go, and it happened to be the 10-year anniversary of the festival. And I was absolutely astonished by what I found there. The big thing that really struck me was I was at the awards night, and I saw a game developer who had had some really incredible success that year with a title that made millions of dollars, sitting with some students who were asking questions along the lines of, we've got a game coming out next week. Do we just put it out, or do we wait for a particular day of the week, or do we need certain assets ready? What do we do? And this game maker was just telling them. And in my experience, these communities were often very insular. It was very don't look at my homework kind of mentality between these larger studios. And here is this extraordinarily successful person that could have been selling that information as a contractor. Instead, just sharing it freely over a drink to some students. And it was really beautiful. And I saw so many examples of this just at that one festival. And suddenly I was just desperately hungry for it. I wanted more of that, and I wanted that for my home. And so I came home and I started putting out feelers to see if I could find, are there even any Tasmanian game makers? Is there anyone making games in Tasmania? I'm ashamed that I don't know. And so I started finding out, and unsurprisingly found a bunch of people who are doing it. And so I found myself in the very strange position of being a games journalist, organizing events and stuff for a bunch of developers. And so we very quickly tried to design this community as a community-driven thing. So it was very much driven by me initially, but I very quickly found people who were keen to contribute and started taking over some of that responsibility for me. And now it's very much a community-driven organization. I still sit on the board and help, but I'm very much someone who sits on the site now and offers advice or connections or whatever that I can. It's very much driven by itself now.
Great.
And yeah, it's mostly a Discord community with a Facebook group as well. It was originally all Facebook, but Facebook sucks. So we've definitely moved to Discord, which is
good. Yeah.
Working out for us. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. And game jams were the other thing. I did Train Jam when I was in the US, and it blew my mind. And so we've been doing an event called Taz Jam, which is a statewide game jam. We don't do them as often as we'd like, because frankly, they're a lot of work and we don't get paid for it.
Yeah.
But we love them, and they've been extraordinarily successful. A very big part of building our community. These game jams with no prizes and no competition, just fun.
You've kind of covered this question, but do you have any other advice for other people looking to build their own local game communities? Like, for example, maybe in a regional town outside Melbourne, or a different city in a different state or country?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yes. I mean, just start. So like, do what I took far too many years to do, and actually just start reaching out and seeing who you can find. And I think you'll be surprised at who's out there. There'll be people who are interested in making games at the very least in your radius. I think the biggest challenge is that often they don't consider themselves game makers. This is actually my kind of biggest criticism of our community here. Is, the surveys come out, the industry surveys, the games industry surveys come out, and a lot of game makers in regional areas and in Tasmania don't fill them out because they don't self-select, they don't self-identify as professional game makers, despite the fact that they're making games to eventually go to market. And so they don't fill them out, and therefore they're not represented, and therefore decisions get made that don't include them as a potential number in that survey data, and that is heartbreaking to me. So start finding people and treat yourselves like game makers. And the best way to do that is to make stuff. Just make as many games as you can.
Yeah, no, great advice. Many other questions about that, but because we only have so much time left, I want to jump into some of the viewer questions. We've gotten a bunch. I may not be able to get to all of them, but let's at least start asking some of them. So on that topic of local communities in Tasmania, we have a question. Do you feel that small places like Tasmania have room for growth in their local games industry, or will it stay a smaller, more cottage industry?
Oh, of course it can. Right now we live in a post-pandemic world where people have been working from home quite successfully for the most part. And so suddenly being remote isn't as big of a challenge and isn't as scary. And we're not that remote. Like, we're a short plane ride away from Melbourne if we want to be in Melbourne when it's safe to travel. So I don't think we will always stay cottage. I don't think we can only be cottage. I think there's always room for growth. But I think we don't want to just grow for the sake of growth either.
Right.
Like, that's a very ugly capitalist mentality. I think if we're going to grow, we should only do it because it is good for us as a community to grow. We should only grow because there are more passionate and interested people who are seeking to do what we're gathering to do. If we're just seeking to have bigger numbers so that we, the organization, can make ourselves look better when we put in for grants or whatever, then that sucks. I don't want to be a part of that. And I think that would be true for the rest of the board too.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's room for growth, of course, but I think that growth should be growth from the heart. Gee, that sucks. I hate that. I said that.
Sorry, man, that's the title of this talk.
No.
Growth for that. We're gonna. Ari, remember to replace the YouTube title with that phrase. Some other questions. Let's go back to thinking about your career in QA. We have one question. What was the tougher grind, games QA or games journalism?
That's a really complicated question because they're both different types of grind. And my QA grind was the grind of someone running their own small business at probably the wrong time. I probably launched that company at the wrong time, which I couldn't have known. So the grind of games journalism is you can never rest, because when you're not working, you're not earning. When you're not pitching, you're not working, you're not earning. Any downtime you have is time you could be spending pitching or writing and therefore earning. And any time you spend away from the internet is an opportunity that you might lose. An editor could come knocking and you'll miss it and they'll just go to the next person. So, and that is grueling. And I don't think that's talked about enough in freelance contexts, journalism aside. I don't think we talk enough about that labor, like the hustle culture, all of that stuff sucks for that reason. It's a very dangerous way to behave over a long period of time. QA, the grind of QA, like if you're working for another company, the grind part is you're going to be doing a lot of repetitive tasks and you're going to get sick of them. I've been doing QA for 20 years and I'm very privileged to no longer be on the tools that much. I get to run the teams and develop the processes and all that stuff, which is something that I'm really passionate about, managing people and all that. I really enjoy that. But the idea of going back to the tools after 20 years is a lot.
Yeah.
So you need to find ways to enjoy it. You need to find ways that you can almost internally come up with your own milestones for doing better. And that could be contributing to better processes or better test cases. For me, it's getting to the point where I can start to affect the design in positive ways. It's kind of what you make of it. If you find it really hard, really kind of hatefully grueling, then don't do it. Yeah. That's a good opportunity to move on to something else.
Let's take some more questions about QA and testing. Do techniques like automated testing have much uptake in games? Tell us a little bit about your experience and thoughts with automated testing.
Sure. I should say up front that I'm not an automation specialist. My QA work is very much on the functional testing side and done manually by humans. Absolutely used a lot of automation techniques in the past, and usually through the adoption of specialists who do that for us. In games, automation isn't that common, and it should be, because they're still software and they can still be attached to by automation suites. It's just that a lot of automation suites aren't very good. They're not very intuitive. They're very clunky. They're a lot of work to maintain. And again, when we're talking about smaller game studios, if you're going to go down the path of doing automation well, you need to invest in it heavily upfront. And then you need to invest in maintaining it heavily over time in order to get the benefits of it. And what are small game studios bad at doing? Investing heavily in things that aren't passion. Like they're just, it's a money thing. It's a money and time thing. So they will usually take the cheaper, safer option of doing manual testing, and they'll often leave it to the last minute. So yeah, automation doesn't get enough of the limelight, but there are some really amazing tools out there that could make people's lives a lot better. And I'm really keen to see more of that occur.
Here's another question. How would someone with intermediate marketing and programming experience get into QA in Australia? I can think of a few paths, but don't know what is most appealing to hiring studios.
The most appealing thing to hiring studios is either experience, but then they're usually looking for someone a bit more senior, It's not common for people to look for junior testers with experience. They'll often put it in their applications, but you've got to be realistic. Testing is often a low-rung entry-level role in a lot of studios, unless they're looking for very senior people. So my advice to someone coming in with no experience would be seek a junior role, but show a lot of enthusiasm for it. I know myself as a hiring manager, if someone can show me in a cover letter that they're actually interested in the discipline and actually interested in building a career in it, that automatically puts you at the top of the pile. I've had some people in cover letters straight up say, would love to get into testing because one day I want to be a designer and I'm really looking forward to stepping out of testing and into design. And that's just a harder justification to make as a manager or a business owner.
Yep.
Because I'm inherently choosing to bring someone in, train them up, and then let them forget it and move on to something else, even if they stay inside my own company. So show some dedication to it.
And a follow-up question there for me, which is like, I think about your own path through your career, kind of bouncing between not just games, but also QA in enterprise software, the software industry. Are you, in retrospect, do you feel like that's been valuable, more valuable than it has been stressful in terms of like getting that experience maybe in a neighboring industry?
I can't recommend it enough, to be honest. I think there's a dangerous mindset that students have, especially, but encouraged perhaps by educators, that if you do a games course or you start working in games, you must stay in games against all costs. And I understand why. It's a wonderful community and it's a really kind of passion-driven thing, and enterprise software often isn't. But the benefit you'll gain from working in a different industry with related skills is remarkable.
Yep.
I wouldn't have had a successful games career if I hadn't had my enterprise software career. I wouldn't have been able to go back into the role that I have today with LiveTiles, which is an amazing role, if I hadn't had run my own games company. Right? Yep. They seem disconnected, but actually those two things are deeply related.
Yep.
And that's QA aside, that's true for graphical artists and any. There's so many shared skills here, especially when you look at film and TV in animation side. Like there's so many skill sets that you can apply to both sides, inside and outside the industry. I can't recommend it enough.
Could not agree with you more. I'm glad I set you up with that extremely leading question. But no, totally agree. We're getting, I think, to the end. It's almost 6:50. So maybe that's a really good note to wrap up on. Thank you, everyone who has been listening, either live or in the recorded version of this talk. And thanks, Jason, for joining us all the way from Tasmania.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me and listening to me talk about QA for an hour.
Yes,
fun.
No, it is always a pleasure, Jason. We, again, in the chat, you can see we've linked Jason's GCAP talk, and you can also go internet search that. It is definitely worth watching if you're a little interested and to hear more about quality assurance for video games. Thanks to the whole ACMI staff. We will be back next week, 6 p.m. Monday, Melbourne time. Thanks, everyone.